Thanks to Patreon supporters and to the regular viewers for your questions. I had too many to be able to reply to all of them, so apologies in advance to those that I don't get to, and let's save time and jump straight in. Some EU countries have seen energy prices increase by 12% this quarter, with an additional 40% increase expected next quarter. While fuel costs are up, the majority of the increase is due to the additional cost of EU carbon emissions permits. Will the cost of EU carbon emission permits force utilities to invest in renewable energy sources as intended, or will the public retract support because the personal cost is too high? This question was asked a week or two ago, and since then the profile of the coming energy crisis has really rather ramped up. I mean, in the UK, we've seen two major fertiliser manufacturers shutting down production because of the massively higher gas prices that they're paying, leading ironically to a CO2 shortage, which is going to have knock-on effects with frozen foods, meat, fizzy drinks, beer and so on. Where does all this come from? A number of things. European stores of gas have been depleted, where normally they would be replenished over the summer in preparation for the coming winter. Some of that is the post-pandemic surge in energy use, which gas providers haven't kept up with. The Russian state-owned gas corporation Gazprom has been accused of limiting the flow of gas into Europe with a view to putting pressure on to open the new Nord Stream 2 pipeline, and there's some evidence to support the suggestion they're doing that. At the same time, a lot of natural gas tankers from all over the world have been shipping by preference to Asia, where prices have been even higher than they are in Europe after a year of extremes, an extremely cold winter followed by an extremely hot summer. And yes, the high level in the EU carbon price has also led to energy providers switching from coal to natural gas, which has depleted stocks even further. Add to that the fact that the pesky wind hasn't been blowing, so all those shiny wind turbines haven't been making much of a contribution, and various other coincidental events taking other alternatives offline. You asked whether the public would end up retracting their support for carbon prices. Well, it depends, A, how much this is allowed to hit the fan, and who or what gets the blame in the popular consciousness. European governments are variously scrambling to protect their citizens from unconstrained energy price increases, and the UK, for instance, has a cap on the prices that energy companies can charge to consumers. That cap's going to be raised, nevertheless it remains a constraint. So prices will go up to a degree, not enough to cover costs for the energy companies, and various smaller companies are definitely going to go to the wall, sadly. If the blame goes to Russia, then the contribution made by carbon pricing will be relatively small beer. If it attaches to the various green initiatives, then it could be very different. I've seen the latter case made in the letter columns of the press, not yet by columnists or leader writers. Bearing in mind that where blame settles and where responsibility lies are not always the same thing. It's going to get worse before it gets better, so let's see how it goes. I then had a long question relating to just this situation, the spirit of which was to ask, in the light of all that, why is the EU rarely critiqued for huge incompetence? It depends where you are and what streams you follow. So the Brexit-friendly right in the UK has certainly had a rich seam of EU critique in the last few years, and there's been internal criticism on the continent in the early days of the vaccine rollout, the missteps that were taken there. But in the UK, the mainstream media is still mostly run by those who voted Remain in the referendum, who will look at the EU's recent missteps through rose-tinted glasses because they remain, for them, the desirable alternative to the barbarian Brexiteers. That said, I have been picking up on a slight rising tide of criticism. I think there is a recognition that the EU didn't have a good pandemic, that Ursula von der Leyen has not provided effective leadership, and that's been reflected in more of the analysis pieces than it used to be. The thing is that I think a lot of people feel that the whole EU project is on a bit of a fragile footing right now. You know, the UK left. Then there were some real internal dissensions and conflicts made all the louder by growing ambitions by the bloc on climate policy and on military focus. Those that want the project to succeed are possibly keen not to talk about how that could all be going wrong, for fear that talking about it you help to make it happen. So you can add that to the list of things considered too dangerous for us to talk about these days. What is the truth about clean coal burning power stations? How clean are they? Is there any future for them? That's the sort of topic you would do a full video on. Quick answer: clean coal is a lot cleaner on pollutants such as sulfur dioxide and ash, some reduction of nitrous oxides. Most coal production does not include carbon capture and storage, and it depends who you ask as to whether the definition of clean coal expects carbon capture and storage. A problem is one of cost, particularly if you're trying to retrofit the technology to existing plants. The main focus for carbon capture projects tends to go to natural gas, where if CO2 capture can go up from the current 90% to something like 99%, you could see how it would become part of a net zero system. Where it applies to coal, it's mostly about getting short to medium term reductions to emissions during the long period when coal is going to be gradually phased out. If there are advances in carbon capture, then who knows how it might play out. But I don't get the sense of any momentum behind a discussion suggesting that coal would have a long-term future. What specific events in your life or in politics caused you to leave the Greens and then the Lib Dems and eventually settle in the non-affiliated status that you hold today? For those of you that don't know, I was involved in the Greens between 1989 and 1992 and the Lib Dems 1993 until about 2002 approximately. And then for nearly 2 decades I've been unaffiliated, a happily floating voter. The time at the Greens was an ongoing soap opera of weirdness, to be honest. I joined for the pragmatic reason that in 1989 they had won an opportunity to influence the larger political agenda with an out-of-the-blue strong election showing in the European elections of 1989. Well, it turned out they weren't capable of rising to that opportunity. Now, although there were lots of things going on, for me the pivotal moment was when the party conference voted to boycott one of the most genuinely green companies out there, which was Ecover. And I tried to get the conference to reverse that decision the following year and failed. In the way that we've seen so often in recent times, the party was clearly, from that debate, was on an ideological purity mission. And that just wasn't my thing. So I joined the Lib Dems because at that point their leader, Paddy Ashdown, was genuinely committed to a more practical but ambitious green agenda, but was also a serious character who was helping the party to punch well above its weight. I got involved, I ended up chairing the Green Lib Dems, was elected onto the Federal Policy Committee, but I started to get disenchanted with the whole dynamics of party politics, the us versus them thing. We're always right, they're always wrong. The deal breaker for me, though, was when Charles Kennedy became leader and he didn't remotely fill the shoes of his predecessor. So I decided then that, someone needed to do the political stuff. It just shouldn't be me. It wasn't how I was built. From there, I went on to work with businesses on their corporate responsibility, and they were just so much more pragmatic about it that I never looked back. I seem to have missed your opinion of the work of Dr. Zharkova and her prediction of a mini ice age in 10 years' time. There are large numbers of people out there that I've not expressed an opinion on, and she just turns out to be one of them. I've not followed her work closely, so a quick search on her comes up with this piece in 2018. Professor Valentina Zharkova breaks her silence and confirms super grand solar minimum. Zharkova's models have run at a 97% accuracy and now suggest a super grand solar minimum is on the cards beginning 2020. Well, that was wrong. We're now into solar cycle 25, seems to be slightly up on cycle 24. That's the first story I found when I looked. Now, I'm guessing from your question that she's now moved back her prediction for the grand solar minimum to start with solar cycle 26, the one after the current one. Well, give me a reason why I would take that seriously. As far as I know, when it comes to what's happening next with the sun, we, as a species, don't really know. There are variables we have no clue about how they really work, so when people predict with a high degree of certainty what's going to happen next, you should be skeptical of that certainty, especially when it's being breathlessly amplified by people wanting to make a contrarian noise because it's part of their public identity. I may have dismissed her too lightly. As always, we'll happily revise that view if there's something more concrete than an ever-shifting prediction that comes to the fore. Mallen, what do you think of the way that Emma Raducanu's win quickly led to a lot of arguing about immigration and diversity? Well, I'm neither surprised nor particularly impressed. A teenager accomplished a massively impressive win on the world stage, did so with style and character. I think the appropriate response is to applaud the win, applaud the effort and commitment and drive it took to get there, look forward to her future success without suddenly expecting her to win every match and pile all the pressure on. That the reaction of some people was to politicise it in a polarising way says everything about them and nothing about Emma Raducanu. The vast majority of Brits that I'd seen were happily accepting of how she got here, impressed with the fact that her maternal heritage meant she could speak fluent Mandarin to her fans in China, impressed with the values she was brought up with that seemed to have done such a good job of keeping her humble and grounded and really good at playing the game that she wanted to play. To then introduce into all of that the jibes about immigrants, comparing her to the people arriving in boats across the channel. I mean, her parents were not illegal immigrants. We could have a discussion about immigration sometime, but it seems the aftermath of a teenager's tennis success really should not be that moment. Especially if in so doing you run the risk of alienating part of the population against her as a result of them being hectored by the obsessive politicos. Now, she's kept out of all of that, rather wisely in my view. Long may she be allowed to do so. I am 59 years old, and never before in my life have I felt so worried, disappointed, angry, disdainful, full of hate, and generally fed up with the human race. Sometimes I really hope things get much worse just to teach the idiots a proper lesson. Am I alone? Is it me that has gone mad? How are you feeling? Thanks for the question. I understand the sentiment, although you don't go into details about the specifics that have most made you feel like this. When it begins to sweep me up, I try to do one of two things, or sometimes even both things. One, realise that all the sources of information we have, mainstream media and most of the independents as well, those that are chasing the algorithms, they are following an incentive they have to focus on the negative. And when things like that are elevated into high visibility, we tend as a species to overestimate how representative those things are, the negative things in this case. And that's something that Hans Rosling showed with his book Factfulness, showing how we always assume that the facts are negative, even though often it turns out they're positive, because that's what we're fed over and over. The second thing is I try to step back and put whatever's going on now into the context of history. You know, these moments have come often before, and this too will pass. Things might well get worse before they do, but that might not even be a bad thing, uncomfortable though it is. I mean, most times in our history have been worse than this. We've been fighting wars more often than we've not. We've had internal strife, disease, superstition, all sorts. We go through periods of stability, interspersed by periods of change, and that change is usually generated by conflict. Even necessary change often has a painful process attached to it. It does seem likely that an extraordinary period of stability might be coming to an end. We might have more troubled times while we work out how we're changing this time. I mean, it's not guaranteed, but maybe. But maybe we need this. It was time, messy and ugly as it appears when you're in the thick of it. You know, you get stronger when you're placed under stress. You find out how strong you become only when you're tested. As they say, the saying goes, a ship in the harbour is safe, but it's not why the ship was built. It could be that we've been comfortable for too long, and that's why we're driving ourselves crazy over microaggressions and equally non-serious matters. Maybe we just need to go through the uncomfortable process, bringing us back to what's important. Shaking out the complacency and entitlement, making us less fragile, more courageous. Or maybe not. Could just be that our nation's in decline. Good times are lived in times of advance and in times of retreat. Kind of helps to know which one you're in. The author of A Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire said that there were numerous points in Rome's decline when the opportunity was there to reverse the process. Maybe we're being faced with one of those moments, and the coming period will be defined by whether we rise to it. People often do rise to these moments. My only real advice would be to let go of the full of hate thing. It's corrosive, it puts you down on a downward spiral where you filter out all those positives and only focus on the negatives. The human race is no different now to how it's ever been, which means, yes, capable of brutality and wickedness and stupidity and venality and all the rest of it, but also heroism and selflessness and kindness and inventiveness and resourcefulness and beauty. Seeing both of those at the same time keeps your feet on the ground. If you're going to see only one, better to focus on the latter, not the former, if you can. So sorry, that's about as far as I can go on generalities. If you want to talk to me about the specifics of how you're feeling, send me a message and we'll chat. At least you're not alone in your pessimism. Case in point. What do you see as the likelihood of a USA breakup/secession in the next decade? Consequences for Americans and the world? Ooh, you're asking me to make a big prediction. Well, forces pushing towards breakup, the deepening polarization not just on opinion but on perceptions of reality, along with demonizing the other side, pushing back against it, the weight of history, not to be underestimated, the fact that there's a middle ground of Americans who would resist the breakup even if the extremes ended up both advocating for it, and the fact that China is emerging as a genuine outside force in the face of which both sides are actually, even now, relatively united. I think the balance is pushing for this being one of those episodes where America falls out with itself, then clears its head as world events forces it to. But you have to add to that the fact that some of those outside forces are doing their best via social media and other forms of manipulation to fan the flames and make it worse. Nevertheless, I think the talk of succession would have to be bubbling up for decades before it became a realistic proposition for all the depth of the current conflict. Are the odds changing that CO2 is not the instigator of climate change? New satellite troposphere temperatures versus model prediction. Should pollution and population be the priority instead? Short answer is no. I've commented on here before that the one place where recorded temperatures right now don't exactly fit the modelling is the mid-troposphere, and that is a puzzle to be solved. It's not new, there's plenty of discussion out there about it already. Now, the fact that skeptics will jump on that one measure and anoint it as the only measure that matters, it's not a surprise, but we can do better than that. So many other measures with multiple lines of evidence are all pointing in the same direction that the existence of one anomaly doesn't come close to raising serious questions over the basic principle. Certainly we want to understand better the disparity, but there's no alternative explanation that is anywhere near as close in terms of fitting the multiple variables, plus the historical record, which I was talking about last Monday. Nothing stopping us from tackling pollution as well. Societies generally are doing that. Population is a more nuanced equation, again probably worth a video on its own. During the COVID crisis, many controversies have arisen where science and public policy have been intertwined. The source of the virus, the efficacy of masks and lockdowns, vaccine safety, ivermectin, etc. This has led to a loss of trust in the scientific establishment, who are held to be subject to political influence or commercial interest. It is a narrative that the climate change skeptics have been keen on for years, but the COVID version, as well as attracting those types, seems to be gaining wider acceptance. Are these two separate phenomena that just look similar? Well, there's two things here. There's a serious question about the role of scientific evidence and advice in public policy making and how that does or doesn't cross a line into technocracy versus democracy. That's common to both. And there's a long discussion to be had about that, which is the one that I find the more interesting. The fact that we have a situation where respectable opinion can hold that the asking of certain questions or the expression of certain opinions is dangerous. That is incredibly corrosive of our ability to function democratically and sensibly. But then there's the other side, because we're developing a reality-defying language of resistance to authority. It's easy to apply to any situation and seems largely about group identity. So not all the issues you listed are the same. So the origin of COVID, for instance, is a different order of question. But with some of the others, things like ivermectin are now following a pattern of reaction against the mainstream solution, adopting and advocating for an alternative. So look, I heard a news story yesterday about how they're going to add folic acid to flour for health benefit reasons. And I immediately thought to myself, well, I expect various people will be jumping onto that announcement and arguing that folic acid is really harmful or something to do with control of the population. So that was 2 days ago, just before shooting this video, an hour ago. Just checked on Twitter. And yep, those sorts of messages already starting to appear. It's intuitively easy to just jump on things like that and create stories out of them. And we now have a group of people that habitually do that. Some of them are just wild and for the crazies, but then others get given sufficient weight to be argued for seriously, like ivermectin. The evidence doesn't stack up to support the people who are talking with total certainty. But then from the outside, ordinary people who are not going to read the clinical trials for themselves, they will look at the advocates, they'll look at the others and find it hard to know what is correct. And the same with climate. There are some, in my view, respectable challenges, particularly to policy proposals and detailed explanations of current changes. Those challenges may or may not be correct, but they do deserve to be engaged because they could be correct. But then the skeptic movement doesn't often distinguish between those and the fantasists who just say, no, temperatures are getting colder, not warmer. Not serious. And the lack of coherence on the part of the alternative voices on both COVID and climate is certainly also one of the similarities. Now there is a question from TR, which was intercepted by YouTube. I got notification of it, but the comment didn't actually appear. You'll probably see why. Would it be ethical or helpful to drop nuclear bombs on China in the same way that dropping atomic bombs on Japanese cities in 1945 to save the lives of US invasion soldiers was considered? No. Not ethical, not helpful. Any country using nuclear weapons in the modern era makes themselves a pariah of history, and probably at best impoverishes the planet for the next century, at best. Look, we know this. Right now, the US got massive blowback because in its retreat from Afghanistan, it mistakenly sent a missile that took out one innocent family that had 7 children. The world has changed a lot since 1945, slaughtering millions of innocent civilians as a weapon of war, as a deliberate first strike, which is how you're framing the question. You would go down in history as one of the greatest villains of the human race, and deservedly so. What are your thoughts on Peter Boghossian's resignation? And do you think this might be the start of a pushback against wokeness? Peter Boghossian is the Portland professor who quit teaching philosophy because of wokeness and cancel culture. I think there's a pushback that's already underway. The problem is that in the US, it's largely party politicized. The challenge is how to get it as something that people on the left do to bring sanity back to their political perspective. Now, you get some moderate leftist figures who will stand against wokery, the likes of Jesse Singal and Katie Herzog. But the consequence for them is that they've been heavily ostracised by many on their own side. So it's a bit too early to say that there's a meaningful backlash. I think it would require some institutions to start showing courage, not just individual writers or individual lecturers. At least in the US. I mean, I think the backlash is in full swing in the UK and starting to make some ground. No guarantees of which ways it goes, but I'm hopeful. Now, a long question about COVID, which starts like this. What if all this is a staged event? China needs to reduce the young male population and the elderly population and accepted the COVID research. They want a war arguably for all the power and money reasons, but also they need to change their demographics post one-child policy. and have too many troublesome young men who can't see how to make a future with a family after too few women. Well, look, we know that China is concerned about demographics. I mean, they've been encouraging families to up the number of children that they have this year. And that's because the growth trajectory that they want, where they overtake the United States as a world economic power, will be held back if their population growth remains at such a low rate. So they are keen to have as many young men to swell the ranks of the workers of the future as they can get. The social problems they've created with a disastrous one-child policy and the fact that it's led to a paucity of girls in their society, it's certainly a huge problem. But you'd say it's rather easier to solve by other means. I mean, even if the Communist Party had the aims you describe, and I don't see the evidence they do, there are many easier routes that you would take to directly address the problem. The idea that a deliberate pandemic would be a rational reaction just doesn't really fit the facts. If they wanted more older people to die younger, you could simply stop trying to raise people out of poverty. But that's not the reflection of what they're doing. Okay, running out of time, so excuse the shorter answers for the last few questions. I'm currently trying YouTube Premium to avoid the increasing volume of ads. The idea is that part of my fee would trickle down to you. Do you know how it works? First of all, thank you. And yes, something like 10% of the revenue that comes from YouTube comes from premium subscribers, so it does make its way through. And indeed, that comes through even when a specific video gets demonetized for advertising. I understand the annoyance with ads. Those who are not on YouTube Premium, you will note that I always make sure to change the default settings to switch off mid-video ads, because I think once at the start is plenty. When YouTube applied their new default to have ads at the beginning, the middle, at the end, I think it applied some retrospectively to old videos. So some of the older videos on his channel might have mid-video adverts. Apologies if that's the case. Fancy trying to explain blockchain and its risks and benefits? No, but thanks for checking. Given that the JCVI has said the margin of benefit is considered too small to support universal vaccination of healthy 12 to 15-year-olds at this time, should 12 to 15-year-olds be vaccinated for wider societal/educational reasons? I think this is a judgment call. There are arguments both ways. If I were Prime Minister and I had only the information that's publicly available, I would be firm that schools had to operate as normal for the sake of the kids' education. And if some parents needed their kids to be vaccinated to reassure them that they were safe, then by all means make it available. But I don't think it's necessary. I wouldn't think government should promote it as if it were. The thing is, look, kids catching COVID isn't a big deal. Kids having the vaccine isn't a big deal. Kids missing their education is the big deal. So whatever it takes for that. At what point might the tech and other industries take steps to stop the flows of capital to China in order to save their own society? There are two versions of the current world order. The one is globalized capitalism, where we site our operations wherever we will have competitive advantage and where we can open up access to possible markets. Then there's the other one, where a government is an adversary looking to use your company as a vehicle to attack your own government and your country's citizens and interests. The tech companies will flip when they give up all the last hope that despite the turbulence, they're still living in the first one, and they come to the conclusion that they're living in the second. It would be better for all of us if we really were living in that first one, so I can imagine that many will be trying to make it happen and will be slow to accept defeat if it turns out that it really can't. We don't want to create conflict by treating people like enemies and leaving them no choice but to behave like enemies. But that's not really where we are with China, according to all the history and the current evidence. How big a future does graphene have in reducing carbon output? No idea. I know you've mentioned it in the comments a couple of times. I think you linked to a video that wasn't working anymore, but I have no opinions about it one way or the other. I know graphene is used in certain types of CO2 filters for carbon capture and storage. I don't know why I should care that it's graphene that does that rather than something else. I mean, platinum's used in catalytic converters. I don't particularly care about that either. Maybe you should tell me what I'm missing in the comments below this video. Do you have any opinions on the actions that governments, as opposed to private industry, should take to reduce CO2 emissions, e.g. research, investments, subsidies, tax breaks, carbon taxes, cap and trade, bans, etc. You'd want to do a full video again to go through all the possibilities, the pros and the cons for all of that. Generally speaking, I don't have specific policies that I want to champion. I'm broadly happy with the different approaches that different governments might want to take. My key criteria are that they should work, they should be effective, and that they shouldn't have massive unintended consequences. Which isn't the same as saying that they have no cost or that there are no trade-offs. I mean, realistically, there's always going to be some of both of those. I tend to think government should take a smart approach to infrastructure in a way that the UK hasn't over the last few years, ignoring as they have the need for investment in reliable baseload power. And they should provide a long-term framework for the private sector to feel confident to be able to invest in innovative solutions. And mostly they should just develop a vision of what it is they're going to do, seek to sell that vision to the citizens of the country, which is also what they're not doing. Right now it's very piecemeal, disconnected, as well as rather incompetently executed. Since France has started to phase out the use of glyphosate-based products by 1st of January 2021, except where there are no viable alternatives to the herbicide, are there any early indicators of any impact, either positive or negative so far? I haven't seen real-world reports on that yet, might be a bit early. I know that authorities were aware that removing glyphosate would increase production costs for farmers, particularly those using no-till and conservation agriculture. I think it was equivalent to a loss in profit of around 16%, but you can't take it as read that expectations in advance and real-world results are going to be the same thing. Now, I'm considering doing a video on pesticides. Not sure whether glyphosate or neonicotinoids. It's not something that I've looked at closely to date, but it is kind of interesting. A long question I've slightly shortened. I know a lot of people who are fully vaccinated because it makes sense, but still think it's unjust to force people to get the vaccine. Listening to the media, I get the impression there are simply pro-vaccine people and anti-vaccine people. What kind of crazy am I to believe in the vaccine and want to protect myself from a terrible natural threat to my life and health, but at the same time think we can have a civil society? The normal answer to a question like this is to repeat that the media highlight polarization. They get more engagement if they cover conflict, which is why they seek out the most extreme of the two positions. But that doesn't wholly cover it here, though. Because with a pandemic, there is a rational argument that you only reach the desirable end goal of herd immunity if a sufficient percentage of people get vaccinated. So those that have been made to be fearful of the disease, whether rightly or wrongly, you can debate that, are very attuned to arguments of blame against those who stand in the way of achieving the goal. And it's not civil, because people feel that those others are putting them and those they care most about at risk. And that's something that government has amplified with its messaging, don't kill granny and all of that. It shouldn't be a thing. But people who haven't faced a threat in their previously comfortable lives don't really know how to deal with it. Maybe we'll come out of the other side with a little more perspective. All right, this has already gone on longer than I like these videos to get, so I'm calling it a halt here. Apologies if I didn't get to your questions. See you on Friday for the news roundup. Thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, please share with anyone else you think would also enjoy it. Word of mouth is really important to us. And if you've not subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? As the saying goes, that subscribe button won't smash itself.